I've got notes, so I shouldn't be speaking from. I should be speaking, but I'm not reading from them. I'll try and do both. So thank you. It is important, I think, this discussion. It's a very important discussion. So I really want to say to Workers' Liberty, well done for trying to organise something. It's not an easy discussion either, and it's so polarised a debate that I think that it's easier to not discuss than to. So I am grateful for this space. I thought that I would talk a little bit about our opposition to fundamentalism as Southall Black sisters, my opposition to it, why we oppose religious fundamentalism, how we do that in the context of being a minority in the UK, are important questions. But in order to understand and even get to that point, I think it's important to say something about the trajectory of Southall Black sisters politics, because I think it helps you understand where we've got to in terms of the point that we've got to. And so I want to start by just giving a little bit of a background to Southall Black sisters. We've always organised autonomously as a black feminist, anti-communalist, anti-racist and progressive organisation. We've been going since 1979 as both a frontline service provider to women, black and minority women, and as an anti-racist campaigning organisation, feminist organisation. So we set up in the 80s, late 80s, 70s, sorry, when there were many silences on issues of race, class and gender within a range, and sexuality of course, within a range of social movements. And we felt the need to organise within those movements, but as autonomous entities, whilst at the same time calling for those movements to incorporate what is now fashionably termed as an intersectional analysis of these interconnections between race, class, sex, gender, and to build progressive alliances and coalitions. So we very much see ourselves not as separate from, but as part of movements that we both contest from within, but also want to create alliances with. I think for me, more than anything, in those early days, we actually took our secular feminist identity for granted. We never really talked about being secular. It was just there. It was there all the time in all our politics, in our outlooks, in our thinking. And the term black was certainly contested. But at the height of black feminist and anti-racist struggles in the 80s, the secular black identity was very much a progressive one. And it was a unifying identity. It enabled us to forge connections and solidarity that transcended divisions of class, ethnicity, caste, and religion within black minority communities and across other communities. So for example, we were very involved in delegations to Northern Ireland, delegations to mining communities, when the miners' strike was going on and so on. So we've always maintained actually that the identity you choose and coalition building are very closely connected, because the identity you choose can limit or increase the potential for alliances. And I think this is one of the key messages for us in these troubling times. I'll come back to that point later. I should, at this stage, clarify what I mean by secularism. I don't mean anti-religion. Secularism does not mean anti-religion. It means a separation of religion from the state. And so religion and political power need to be separated. That's what we mean. It means that the rule of law and other essential political, legal and civil society institutions and their functions should not be informed by religion. Secularism on its own doesn't guarantee equality either, or democracy for that matter. And we've known very many totalitarian regimes that are secular, but are hardly democratic. But secularism is an important precondition. And that is why for democracy, and that is why demand for a secular state must also be tied to demand for democracy. A democracy that is actually meaningful in that it enhances rather than hinders access to fundamental rights and freedoms in private and public spaces. So unlike the 70s and the early 90s, 80s and early 90s, what makes the ground beneath us so shaky now is new forms of religious identities have become the counter-hegemonic frameworks of resistance to racism, and to neoliberalism, and to imperialism. And that makes coalition building that much more difficult. In the context of the war on terror, many on the left, I don't mean all, by no means all, but some, and quite a significant amount, have accepted without question the use of religion as a key definer of political identity in minority communities. Many social movements have actually embraced and given space to religion and religiosity in their movements without questioning what these religions and religiosity bring with them. And this is as true of feminism as of other social mobilizations. But what we're left with is a growing acceptance of religious identity politics, and with it an increasing gap between movements for social justice and movements for gender equality. Because as someone who is in the movement for gender equality, which is also social justice, I'm often opposing religious identity politics. In fact, Southall Black Sisters were one of the first organisations in the UK to respond to the resurgence of religious fundamentalism worldwide. And by religious fundamentalism, mean the use of religion for political purposes. We set up Women Against Fundamentalism, which was born in the midst of the unprecedented furor surrounding Salman Rushdie and the publication of Satanic Verses. At the high point of that furor, if you remember, was the fatwa that was issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who declared him a blasphemer against Islam and called for his death. And what happened after that was very quickly the media reduced the whole Rushdie affair to a debate between supporters of Rushdie, who was seen to be mainly those from the artistic community, you know, intellectual writers, artists, defending freedom of speech, and Muslim religious leaders, many of whom were calling for the book to be banned and supported the fatwa on the grounds that Rushdie had offended religious sensibilities, even though many had not even read the book. So that was the depolarized debate. And it's not surprising to some extent that the media characterized this debate as between artistic freedom of speech and these backward medieval Muslim leaders calling for supporting the fatwa, because where was the left in all of this? The left was silent on this question. And so it was left to Women Against Fundamentalism, Southall Black Sisters, Women Against Fundamentalism. And Women Against Fundamentalism is an organization of women of varied ethnic and religious backgrounds to break apart this kind of polarity of thinking, this kind of binary, and to assert the need to challenge both racism and religious fundamentalism at the same time. That racism could not be an excuse not to challenge religious fundamentalism was our mantra. So I kind of feel today bookended by two events that are linked. The Rushdie affair in 1989 and Charlie Hebdo, January 2015. What both Rushdie and the Charlie Hebdo events have in common is the struggle for free speech and the right to dissent. I don't think I can take any pleasure way back in 1989 when WAF was set up and predicted the rise and resurgence of religious fundamentalism globally, that we can take any pleasure in the fact that we predicted that one. Because even then, I don't think any of us understood or even imagined the extent of the rise of religious political movements and the violence and atrocities that have followed globally. And of course we now speak in the shadow of a litany of unspeakable horrors that are taking place. The recent massacre of what were, contrary to popular view, radical left-leaning journalists in Paris. Many of them were trade unionists, who had links with trade unions, were members of the Communist Party in France. They were not racist in that sense. They were left. They were part of the left. And of course, not only the murder of those journalists, but also no less shocking acts of religious extremist violence, murder, and even genocide committed by religious political extremists in Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Kenya, India, and elsewhere. And who is that violence and genocide perpetrated against? In fact, it's on the majority of people who are civilians, who are often from the same religious background as the perpetrators. And the list of such atrocities is, of course, endless. But actually, I think what is also endless is the underestimation of religious fundamentalism by many on the left. So in the UK, the Rushdie affair was my actual initiation into the politics of religious fundamentalism, and actually into the politics of resistance to religious fundamentalism. A resistance that developed with the passage of time and eventually stalled when life ended, but certainly kept up by its Southall Black sisters. But at its highest, when we were challenging religious fundamentalism, we didn't compromise on either challenging racism and imperialism and religious fundamentalism. Our mantra that both have to be waged at the same time is an important one, because actually racism, imperialism and fundamentalism are in each other's environment, and they are absolutely linked. Whilst we've been at pains to point out that free speech does have limits, particularly when it incites hatred and violence, the demand for extension of the blasphemy laws, which was a demand that began following Rushdie, which had historically privileged Christianity in the UK, was not one of those limits to free speech. We actually opposed blasphemy laws and said it shouldn't be extended, and actually that we were calling for the disestablishment of the church as a way to deal with that problem. We also made the point, though, that free speech was not just a liberal, but a feminist and a left issue. And it's particularly important for us to make those connections with feminism, because I think that the right to dissent from patriarchal religious and cultural orthodoxies has always been an important part of the armory of feminism. So our analysis was showing that the real losers, the emergence of a religious culture and politics of causing offence, which seems to have created this fallacious idea of the right to be offended, were women, sexual minorities, and other religious minorities, more often than not from the same communities. And I think that's proved to be the case if we look at what's happened since Rushdie till now in the UK. Because those who targeted for blaspheming and thereby vilified and threatened and intimidated and assaulted are those who dare to show irreverence to the question of religion and want to criticize religion, however mildly. So if you think about it, the Birsky play in 2005, I don't know if you remember that, which was a play that tried to depict rape in a Sikh temple. That was, according to Sikh fundamentalists, seen to offend Sikh sensibilities, and it was pulled from the Birmingham Repertory in 2005. And then we had 2006, the famous Indian painter who's now died, known as the Picasso of India, M.F. Hussain, who put on an exhibition in London, and following protests by Hindu fundamentalists, was also pulled, because Hindu fundamentalists said that his portrayals of Indian female deities depicted as naked offended Hindu sensibilities. So what you had, that exhibition banned too. So, and you see vigilante groups of young Muslim men linked to Muslim fundamentalist movements in East London entire hamlets, who've become the self-appointed guardians of community morality in that part of London. And what they're doing is policing women and their dress codes and policing sexuality and everything else. So you see Hindu, Sikh, Muslim fundamentalists mobilized, campaigning and protesting aggressively, and sometimes by protesting, actually blur the distinction between protest and intimidation. Everyone has a right to protest. But they actually go beyond that and use intimidating, violent, threatening tactics to terrorize and censor democratic debate. So what we grappled with very early on is that religious fundamentalism, or the religious right, is nothing to do with religion. It's all about power and politics, and the use of violence to suppress alternative ideas and any form of dissent from religious orthodoxies. It glorifies criminality and disguises it as a fight for a just cause, even disguises it as defense of human rights. It uses violence to destroy free, open, democratic societies created out of struggles for accountability. The end game of all religious fundamentalism is hatred and intolerance, silence and violence. It leads to the destruction of aspirations, hopes and efforts to be better human beings. Its aims are to destroy our capacity to imagine what justice and equality might look like. Ideas that should be, to borrow the title of an article by Indian historian Dilip Simian, ideas that should be the music, the very music of humanity. So much in the same way that it was argued that Rushdie was provocative and caused religious offense and contributed to the stereotyping of entire Muslim populations as backward, medieval, barbaric, there are many who now see themselves as part of the broad left and as anti-racist, who today similarly argue that Charlie Hebdo caused religious offense, contributed to stereotypes of Muslims, and that it's fed into very racist and intolerant French establishment culture in which many Muslims live as the underclass, subjected to lifelong deprivation, criminality, alienation. They also argue that what occurred was not satire, since it involved the powerful insulting the powerless. These are the dominant themes that seem to be emerging around the debate within the left on Charlie Hebdo. And I'm not denying for 1 minute that ghettos, deprivation, racism, humiliation, alienation suffered by migrants, Muslims and non-Muslims, in France and anywhere else in Europe, don't deserve political analysis and resistance. And actually there's been a rich history of both. And certainly we in Southall Black Sisters see racism and institutionalized racism and how it plays out in the everyday lives of the most vulnerable. But what is also urgently required is the need to grasp and accept the fact that the story of Charlie Hebdo doesn't start with the racist context alone, or the aftermath, the racist aftermath and backlash of the brutal killings, but actually starts with the killings themselves. They are the product of a religious far-right ideology that is nihilistic and no different from fascism. It is not possible to justify, seriously justify without loss of integrity, the idea that such killings are the consequences of the dispossessed and the disenfranchised. I think we should try telling that to the parents of the children who were killed in the massacre in Pakistan at the end of last year, or to the parents of the children who've been abducted and killed in Nigeria. Are these people not also part of the dispossessed and the disenfranchised in their own countries? And I think that this idea that the left endlessly, many on the left endlessly peddle the view that Charlie Hebdo is racist and Islamophobic, and that the terrorists are merely the victims of the war on terror. What they're doing, in fact, is embracing, denying, minimizing, apologizing, or underestimating the threat that is posed by all religious fundamentalist movements that are both global spanning and also context specific. So what we're witness to when the left tried to argue that this is an anti-imperialist and an anti-racist response, is actually we're witness to a new construction of resistance, anti-racism resistance, that is actually based around religion. And it's based around the politics of the right to be offended. And it has poisoned progressive activism and actually allowed the state to tiptoe around religion and accommodate backward, and they are medieval, demands, including the right accommodation of Sharia principles in family law. Now, this is something that's very close to my heart and something that I've been involved in the last few years, which is the way in which the state has accommodated religion to such an extent that we're seeing religion encroach in the way in which the legal system operates, in education. You all remember Trojan War, Trojan Horse, and all those other matters. I just want to give you two examples. If you remember, and many of you probably do, the end of 2012, the growing practice of gender segregation at public events in universities. Yeah? And the university's governing body, the UUK, actually put out guidance permitting, legitimizing gender segregation in public spaces if external speakers demanded so, in university spaces, that is. And their argument was that external speakers had the right to manifest religion. Actually, they didn't question the issue of sex discrimination and all of that. And the guidance just simply legitimized gender apartheid. It took a campaign and threats of legal action by us and others before the UUK agreed to withdraw that guidance. We argued that the UUK had violated the equality and non-discrimination principles enshrined in the Public Sector Equality Duty and the Human Rights Act. And that these laws that we were using as a tool to challenge were themselves products of hard, long battles and campaigns and challenges by feminists, racial minorities and others, and in fact are part of the post-war settlement as a result of the collapse in civilized values that the Second World War represented. So, but there were many people on the left, including feminists like Laurie Penny, who argued that we were being anti-racist, and that she reduced, in fact, I remember her and others reduced our protest to mere hyperbole or Islamophobia, and said that it was yet another attack on Muslim people. And then, 2013, learning nothing from this episode, we had the Law Society wading in, a body representing the interests of the legal profession, no less, following the UUK by issuing guidance on how lawyers can prepare Sharia-compliant wills. And it was drafted with reference to fundamentalist texts who defend the most abhorrent practices, including death by stoning. The guidance endorsed so-called Sharia succession rules, which stipulates that as a general rule, a male is worth twice that of a woman, so she receives only half of what a man would receive, and that illegitimate children have no right to inherit. So the guidance accepts without question in the inherent discrimination that exists in Islam and indeed in other religions against women and against children born out of marriage. And of course the Law Society doesn't even ask how it possibly knows what is and isn't Sharia law. There's no such thing. There are personal Muslim codes that operate throughout the Muslim world, but they're varied and they're vigorously contested and targeted for reform or repeal, particularly by feminists, sexual minorities and others. The real problem, actually, the thing that got most of us is that the Law Society, instead of upholding a rights-based culture, upholds a Sharia-compliant culture and fosters it and promotes it and wades into doctrinal territory. And of course, if you look at the Law Society website, they've probably pulled all this now, but in the past, this came after a whole program on training courses that they developed on how to encourage Sharia compliance in relation to the question of family, children, property and financial settlements in minority communities. So all of this gives succor to Islamists and to other religious fundamentalists in other communities to argue for separate religious laws to operate, for parallel legal systems to operate. And in doing so, the argument is that secular human rights laws can apply to the majority, but minorities must settle for second best. And they must settle for, you know, second-rate religious, patriarchal codes of conduct. And actually what we see operating is an inverse form of racism. Because what the Law Society is actually doing is preventing from a culture of human rights from taking root in minority communities. And they're kind of left to their own devices. That's how I think we should look at it. And it actually, the struggle for a secular human rights framework to apply to everyone is made much more difficult when you have a government that goes on and on about upholding British, so-called British values. Nobody quite knows what they mean, but I assume they should mean respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And just when they, you know, encourage everyone to subscribe to British human rights, what do? They also threaten to repeal the Human Rights Act, particularly every time the courts want to assert the application of human rights where there have been state abuses of power. So we have a real mix here of interests, vested political interests, sometimes converging, sometimes diverging. But what we are seeing, there is no question of that, in this country, is a growing alignment of religion and the law, and the state's support for non-state religious arbitration systems. And I won't even go into that, but maybe we can discuss it in the question and answer session. So what we're really seeing is the rise of far-right religious and political movements across Europe and everywhere else. And they're growing in power, they mirror each other. And whilst they appear as if they oppose each other, they can and do converge and overlap. And what do they overlap on? Mainly to maintain authenticity, purity of identity, culture, and tradition. That's as much true of the EDL, BNP, as it is true of the Muslim fundamentalists and the Sikhs and Hindus as well. And their common desire is to protect extremist ideology and to suppress or eliminate ideas that seek to promote non-violence, empathy, compassion, and the value of human life for everyone. There's another debate raging at the moment, particularly amongst South Asian women, and that is whether or not to support an amendment to the Serious Crimes Bill that wants to criminalise sex selection abortion. So what is sex selection abortion? For those who don't know, it is also known as female feticide. And it's a practice involving the abortion of a fetus for no other reason than it is a female. And it is a practice that's widespread and part of the continuum of violence and discrimination faced by women in India and in the Indian subcontinent. It's really pervasive in those countries, and it's reached crisis proportions, because together with female feticide, female infanticide, and other forms of violence, what we have in India is a situation where 15 million women are missing. It's creating an absolute crisis and skewing sex ratios in certain parts of the country, and that in turn means that families and people are trafficking women from other parts, poorer parts of Asia and poorer parts of the country to those regions where sex ratios really skew, Punjab, Haryana, and others. So it's a real problem. However, in the UK, there is only anecdotal evidence that's taking place among South Asian communities here. And the case studies that are produced by the pro-amendment lobby are actually conflating sex selection abortion with domestic violence. If you look closely, all their case studies are actually about domestic violence involving women who've given birth to girls rather than coercions of women into abortion. So, and where does the statistical evidence here come from to support criminalising sex selection abortion? It actually comes from Migration Watch. Suspect, one would wonder, that agenda. And yet, despite this lack of evidence, or suspect evidence, some women's groups are demanding vociferously criminalisation of sex selection abortion in the UK. They're publicly claiming they're not seeking to amend, to encroach on the abortion laws of the country, but seeking to clarify abortion laws, in which case one wonders why they're seeking to embed it in a criminal bill, and why they can't produce guidance rather than actually go for this amendment. But actually, you know what the biggest problem is? The biggest problem is the whole thing's driven by the Christian right. Fiona Bruce MP, who is part of the evangelical Christian right, and the Christian right is being supported by the Hindu, Sikh and Muslim right. They're all behind this. They're all behind this amendment. Now, such alliances are not new. They're really commonplace on the international stage, in human rights forums and so on. But here we have a situation where the anti-immigration right and the religious right have come together. And actually what we do see it is an attempt to curtail women's reproductive rights. And what can only be described as an instrumentalized manner. And they're using the language of choice, the right for women not to be forced into sex selection abortion, to actually destroy the right of choice. So, I should end. I should say that the stories we should start with are actually those of the bravery and the courage of countless civilians around the world who, through a growing sense of injustice, challenge and reject religious fundamentalism and refuse to underestimate it. They are the direct targets of criminality and genocide, and they are also the dispossessed and the alienated. I should also add that yesterday I learned 3 Muslims who were gunned down by an atheist in the US, and in what seems to be a revenge attack, and revenge for Charlie Hebdo. And the details are not clear, but all the signs suggest that this is a hate crime. And the government has been arrested, but I'm pretty sure that none of us would condone the killings of those who hold religious beliefs in the same way that we don't condone the killings of those who don't hold religious beliefs. So what this tells us is that we do need to assert secular values, but that more importantly, we need to assert, safeguard secular democratic spaces and values. And we must do so without abdicating moral responsibility and in solidarity for all those who dare to speak up against religious fundamentalism and other forms of oppression. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's basically covered much of what I wanted to say. But I don't have a prepared speech, so that should help. Well, talking about religion and fundamentalism, first I would like to say I am an atheist, and I'm not just an atheist, I'm what some would call a militant atheist, because I speak strongly against religion. And I always say I have no excuse I have no apology